joining us. Sanusha, what a pleasure. Always great to speak to you. How does the ANC handle this?
Good morning, Gareth. Always a pleasure to be on the show with you. I think it's a very tricky one for the ANC this time around because it's Mr. Jacob Zuma. You can see from some of the media reports giving us a bit of an impression of what was discussed yesterday at the special NEC meeting is that there's this idea that Mr. Jacob Zuma is not above the law, that the constitutional court and the rule of law still prevails in this country. And so the idea was there was a need, or perhaps a speculation, that a political solution should be found to this whole situation. And I think that's what drives the ANC into this tricky situation and a much more deeper dilemma than previously. Because at the end of the day, Mr. Jacob Zuma has thrown the entire kind of context in which this whole situation has now unraveled into disarray.
So when we talk about the ANC, obviously they're going to come out and say that they respect whatever the Constitutional Court judgment is, whatever the Pietermaritzburg High Court judgment is. It's the internal factions, and I know the party hates the word factions, but based on what we saw outside in Kandla over the weekend, there's still a lot of ANC supporters who are going to come out in numbers, current ANC members, to support the former president. How does the ruling party handle that dynamic, remembering as well who else we saw on stage outside in Kandla on the weekend?
I mean, Gareth, I think that's where the actual dilemma for the ANC starts, because what you saw happening at Nkandla over the weekend were many violations. Apart from the fact that you had one suspended member of the Secretary General of the ANC standing on the podium and making very, very, emotive statements, if that's the right word to use, around the situation. But at the same time, I think what's also very frightening is that the ANC has to decide what kind of disciplinary action it wants to take and how much that disciplinary action has to be embedded on the idea that it has to show its mettle and say that this time around we're not going to allow any loopholes to happen. And I think that is where the dilemma and the tricky situation comes from. Because it's one thing to say, to denounce what happened over the weekend at Nkandla. The other avenue of this is what action do you take and how punitive or how much deeper you're going to go. You know, is it just enough to say, I feel this is what we need to do or this is how we're going to deal with it? But at the end of the day, you know, we always remember that the ANC has also reminded us that nobody's bigger than the party, and now we're sitting with that situation where they have to put their money where their mouth is.
And while I think many people will agree that there's no one bigger than the party itself, there is one particular individual, though, Sanusha, who arguably is. Not only is he the number one in the party, he's also the number one citizen in the country, and I cannot imagine how difficult it is to wear both of these hats right now. The current president of the country has to, of course, uphold the Constitution and support the Constitution. It's what he's sworn oath to. At the same time, he's fighting a numbers game, a popularity game as the leader of the ANC. So what does Cyril Ramaphosa do this morning with what is less than 48 hours before this apparent arrest of his former boss in this case?
I think, you know, the time has come for Cyril Ramaphosa to actually perhaps think about, you know, being the president of the party and being the president of the republic. Which one is the greater? And we always argued that the party and the state have had this very, very incestuous relationship. What happens in the party seeps into the state, and then, of course, we all get caught in the crisis of this ruling party. Now, to deal with this individual who people are claiming is somebody that has the strong support base, etc., it's in KZN, it's in a rural area, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, the challenge for Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, or President Ramaphosa, is whether or not he is able to stop the enablers within his party from enabling Mr. Jacob Zuma, and more importantly, how does he do that? I think the specter of threat that this is going to destabilize the country, throw it into a civil kind of instability, is not something that we need to get threatened into. I think that's the challenge. The most important thing is sorting it out in the party and disabling the enablers. I think all of those who have basically stood there and decided that we're going to enable a person who is no longer the president of the country and basically do this under the watch of Cyril Ramaphosa is going to be very interesting to see. The press briefing later this morning is going to be critical in that respect.
Okay, let's also, just before I say goodbye to you this morning, Sanusha, can we talk about the 2IC, the second in charge? The second in charge, we know, recently heading off to Russia for health concerns, we understand, essentially leaving the number one standing man alone on this. What's your take on David Mabuza?
It's a very interesting trajectory right now. I think David Mabuza is, if in terms of his role as a deputy president, I think it's been very ceremonial. He's been given a briefing Parliament on the rollout of the coronavirus vaccine and so forth and so forth. I think right now the question is, what is that purpose of the DP? Is it as effective as we thought it would be? And where does it go from here? I think at the end of the day, even if Mr. David Mabuza was in the country, etc., the idea that he'll be basically, pushing the envelope, pushing the dynamics, is not something that I thought would happen. So at the end of the day, it's still Ramaphosa would have had to deal with this, but managing it internally in the party.
Sanusha Naidu, it's always a pleasure speaking to you. I'm sure we'll speak again shortly here on the South African Morning. What a pleasure it is. Sanusha Naidu, Institute for Global Dialogue and political analyst, giving us her thoughts on what's happening within the ANC and how they handle the former president, Jacob Zuma.